Well, what a great privilege it is to be a first speaker after the feast. What a great feast it was. And just coming out of the Feast of Tabernacles. And, have you ever gone to town and find you forgot something, and you go, oh, I forgot that. Well, you can plan ahead. So this night we're going to be covering the 6th lesson in the 15th book of Israel, chapter 6. And this is Yeshua's memorial. Now, we just come out of the Feast of Tabernacles, and we're looking forward to the next feast. As we do in the House of Yahweh, we basically live from feast to feast. We finish one feast, and we set our goal and our sights on the next feast. And so what I would like to encourage you to do is, as we review this Yeshua's memorial, from the 4th month, 3rd day of 2015, how about we look forward to the next feast with a plan to succeed? Not a plan to arrive at Yeshua's memorial this coming year forgetful failures, but actually successful succeeders. Here on page 59, starting off with this lesson, we're going to turn over to Isaiah 53, which is where we'll be spending some time this evening. The one sent in these last days prophesied to establish the house of Yahweh and to teach these laws. The great witness Israel says, Shalom, everyone. I hope you have your books of Yahweh with your pencil and your paper. I'm glad to get this extra time before sunset. And this is a great blessing. It was a great inspiration when Pastor went through this. But this is a really exciting lesson this evening. When you really stop and pay attention to it and take the time to go through it on your own and meditate on this lesson that he's giving here tonight, it's so full of knowledge and understanding, and it was just such an awesome sermon when it was given, and it continues to be even now. We'll start here with this prophecy in Isaiah 53 that was laid before Yeshua as the will of Yahweh, described on paper for this generation. You've got to get in your minds that we are the fulfillment of this plan. We're the fulfillment of this plan that will actually receive authority along with Yeshua. Now, in this lesson tonight, pay close attention to this, the plan of Yahweh, this whole idea of the plan. And what I want you to get into your minds is to understand that this is the development of a plan. What we're doing in these last days right now is the fulfillment of a part of this plan. But over the millennia, with each work called out to do their work in their time, all of this together is the development of this plan of Yahweh. And I use the word development because I want to impress on your minds that this is something that takes place over a period of time, and it continues to grow, to develop. And think of the idea that we use often with, like, the birth of a nuclear baby or nuclear war, or even a child of Yahweh. We're likened to a newborn, like an infant, and we have to grow and develop and mature. And this is what the house of Yahweh has been doing all this time over these thousands of years. It's been growing and developing. And so you can think back to Abel. Okay, there was certain things done at that time, certain things proven, and then you had Noah, and he proved certain things, and then it was passed on through his sons, and it carried on. We saw in the times of Moshe, the children of Israel, coming out doing their work, and then the time of the prophets doing their work, up to the time of Yeshua. So all that first 4,000 years culminating in that great accomplishment of achieving Yeshua. Now we see there was more work to be done. This plan had to continue to develop even more. Last feast, we had the opportunity to read the laws. And something else I want to bring across to you tonight is that this era that we're in right now, the House of Yahweh, is not meant to repeat previous works. In other words, we do follow a pattern. We see that when we have the menorah, when we have the way the priests do things, the way the judges do things. We have the ark, the testimony. This follows a pattern, but we're not meant to be a duplicate of a previous work. And this is something that we see in the world that people get tripped up on, that they look in the scriptures and they say, well, I got to be just like this work, or you have to be just like this work. They had a work to do in their time, but we have a special work to do in our time. And so we read these laws, and we uphold all of the 613 laws of Yahweh. But understand that you don't fulfill all the laws yourself. You don't, for instance, there's some laws that apply to the high priest, there's some laws to apply to women, but you uphold those laws in your household, the laws of the clean and unclean. Okay, that applies to everybody. But there's certain laws that apply to certain individuals or certain situations at certain times. And this is what's important to recognize, that all of the laws are there for a purpose, but some of those are not for us right now, but we uphold those because we recognize that they're necessary and important to accomplish certain things, especially when you're starting off from scratch and you have this new wave of students coming into the House of Yahweh that need to be taught and trained. That during that 1,000 years, we're going to be dealing with people, and we're going to need these laws in order to accomplish certain things. Even though at that time, they won't all be necessary, like some of the laws of sacrifice aren't all necessary for us. It's not required of us at this time, but nonetheless necessary. Now, Pastor is putting together this plan to help us understand our role in these last days. And it's actually a commission that is set before Yahweh's people, Yeshua being the first to receive, the first of mankind to receive authority. And in Genesis 1:26, we see the finishing of the work was not even prophesied until this last generation, in the last days. I have here with me the second volume of the Mark of the Beast. A truly outstanding work here. And the chapter 1 is the Yahweh's commission to the house of Yahweh. And that's the word we saw used in verse 3 here of the lesson tonight. Severe persecution. Let's see, I'm going to skip down a paragraph here. Why is one group who keep the commandments and have the testimony of Yeshua Messiah protected, while other groups suffer persecution? The key to this answer is found to this. The key to the answer to this question is found in Revelation 12:13, and just an excerpt from that is showing that a man was brought forth. Bringing forth the man-child is not speaking of giving birth to a baby. Revelation 12:14 is speaking of bringing forth as proclaiming the man, Yeshua Messiah, to others. it's speaking of carrying out the commission given to the house of Yahweh by that man, Yeshua Messiah. A commission to take Yahweh's message to all the world by both preaching and publishing it. And then he goes through Matthew 24:14, Yachanan Mark 13:10, preaching and publishing. The house of Yahweh both preaches through the use of the cassette tape sermon. Now we have the advance of that with the computer. Publishing through the Prophetic Word magazine, monthly newsletter. And we've seen this work develop as well, because we see the reports on Sabbath that we get. And of course, the other important part of this is that this work is protected for that purpose. And this is what we see here in verse 4. But Yeshua understood these prophecies, and when he read this prophecy right here, he knew it was he who was being spoken of. His family had a very guarded training period. And understand that Yeshua understood this through prophecies. And remember that all the prophets prophesied until Yachanan. So all these prophecies were given aforetime, and it was necessary for these prophecies to be brought forward, because now in these last days, how do we know who the witness is? And how can we verify that Israel Hawkins is the witness? It's because of the prophecies written about him, just like the prophecies that were written about Yeshua. And so these prophecies that Israel is fulfilling in this time period and has fulfilled, even without his knowledge, like receiving his name, taking on his name, all of these add up to evidence and proof to confirm he is who he says he is. And he knows who he is because of the prophecies written about him. He knows what was fulfilled in his lifetime. And, certain things he saw and set out purposely to fulfill, like, it'll be for a time, and so forth. But then there's other prophecies that we read in the Mark of the Beast that Israel didn't realize himself until years later, that how he fulfilled a prophecy. Verse 6. So this work, it all started with Abel, and Satan managed to have him killed, but his work lived on like the apostles' work is living today. Yahweh laid a foundation with the 12 disciples, and we're tied to that, and we are tied to that foundation as been brought from Genesis 49:10. But we were commissioned, and to be commissioned means given an order for or authorized to build or produce something. And it's kind of like that word Great Khan Benjamin brings up, like coincident, like it's co in combination, or two things, or in agreement with an incident that Yahweh brought forth. And this is kind of like this word co-missioned, co-mission. It's like they say, we're on a mission. Well, we are, and this is part of it. And we're teamed up with Yeshua. Yeshua is tied to it also and commissioned. And remember, this is according to prophecy and done, it was authorized by Yahweh, by the living will of Yahweh that came down from heaven. This true manna of life that came down from heaven. This true manna, this is what will give life. Okay? The laws of Yahweh. What we're reading right here in our books of Yahweh, and what Pastor is presenting us here in these books of Israel. So Yeshua saw and recognized these prophecies. He was taught by his parents, and of course then he was inspired by Yahweh. Yahweh increased his understanding, and he even surpassed the understanding his parents had. And our children today are also receiving this advanced learning from the priest Yisrayl. And then Yisrayl teaches and preaches the message. It calls us out. And since some of us are appointed to be priests and given that assignment to teach others and teach others to teach others and so forth. So our children have the benefit of this advanced knowledge. And so Yahweh shows us how to diligently train up our child in the way he should go. And he shows us the zeal that must be put forward in this, pushing it daily with our children to get them into the classes, into the schools, and into the night lessons, always showing that zeal and diligence. Now we have the Israel Says program that you can get them off of the evil parts of the computers with and get them on to studying to Israel Says. You know, it takes a lot of zeal and self-control to counter the deception and the negative influence of this world that comes through that computer. So we need to be on ball with that. Now, in these last days, knowledge has been increased so we could have access to this knowledge, and so it can be broadcast throughout the world. This is something that the previous works didn't have because they didn't need to do that at that time, in their time. Verse 11. Now look at this prophecy in Isaiah 53. And he says in verse 1, "Who has believed our report?" Well, not many do. You know, there's a handful in Galilee. And you can think about the way it was for them. You can look at this evidence and look at how we live today. You know, we don't play into this system to make them oodles of money and things. You know, we're not real proactive in politics and the beastly system's way of accumulating wealth and promoting holidays and things like that. But our mind is set on the plan of Yahweh. We're kind of stubborn and bullheaded that way. All we want to do is study the book of Yahweh, search out and read the book of Yahweh. And so we're not much used to these worldly kingdoms. They don't have much respect for us. And when the book of Yahweh was taken to Jerusalem, along with the feasts and set up, and they would go to Jerusalem and they would travel there, and many would go there, and there they would hear the book of Yahweh read daily. And once they heard it read, they could also recognize that these kings that have been placed over them, over in the ruling nations, and the priests that were ruling these kings, the kings and the priests and the high priests of the ruling religions, they could recognize that they weren't keeping those laws that they were reading about. And so, you know, they viewed them as hypocrites, and it exposed their sins, so they weren't very popular for that. And so, now in this time period, we're commissioned to get this work accomplished. There's a plan being worked out, starting with Abel, that's come down to our time with this modern technology, but was actually prophesied to be able to be done in this time period. Now, there has been an increase in knowledge, and that was necessary in this time period, but it's kind of a two-edged sword. You know, it allows us to really dive into the truth of the Scriptures, but then it can kind of cut coming back out because the repercussions are, you know, court dates and imprisonments and persecutions and these kinds of things. It may wound us, but it's not going to kill us. And so these priests at that time, you know, you can imagine Yeshua in that time period. He was a worker. The Pharisees, they loved to have the chief seats and to be prestigious. But Yeshua, he was nothing to notice that way. And he wasn't in the popular crowd of the Pharisees at that time. But the people were hearing these laws, And they were hearing these priests and the Pharisees saying one thing but doing another, or allowing another. So they were able to manipulate the public, letting them hear what they wanted to hear. Then these people would hear these laws and they'd be compelled to keep the laws of Yahweh. And then from time to time, these revolutions would rise up, and they'd quickly seek to squash these revolutions to keep them from spreading and keeping the people from asking too many questions. So Yeshua was a worker. He wasn't anything prestigious like the Pharisees. He wasn't someone who sat in a high seat and said, "Come and praise me," like the Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, and Herodians did. And he had other things to talk about. And Yeshua was very strong in this purpose of bringing forth the message. And he taught his disciples so well that they knew, even to the point that Yeshua was going to be killed. But they loved him so much that they just put that out of their minds and continued to press on and to remain faithful to him and his instruction. Here on page 62, in verse 23, you can tell by the remarks that were made. These are evidences that we kind of read between the lines in the Scripture. You can think about, well, what would it be like for me to be living in that time period? Well, the remarks that were made by Yeshua and others like him in order to take care of the widows. You know, what's it take to take care of a widow or to feed the hungry? You have to know that Yeshua was a busy man. He takes his responsibility seriously, just like Yahweh does. Yahweh is a busy Heavenly Father. Somebody who's helping all the time and caring about you as he did his disciples and the hundreds and thousands who followed him. So you can see by this that Yeshua related to life and living much differently than the Pharisees did. And Yeshua's life was for the purpose of fulfilling Yahweh's laws and the prophecies, so that all others, including ourselves, may also have life. So we have all these details, the capture, the imprisonment, the torture, the grave, even the description of the grave that would take place here. And it didn't take place for several years later, in fact, almost 1,000. So from Isaiah to the time of Yeshua, Isaiah was in 760 BY, before Yeshua. So it wasn't till, that many years later that this actually took place. These prophecies were already in place by the time Yeshua came along and was able to understand them. And he said, "You're fools if you don't believe these prophecies." Every detail of his life was painted here. A painting is like an impression or a representation of the actual thing. And this is what we can see through these scriptures. Yeshua was a willful sacrifice as part of his character, a laborer. And he and those who followed him were accused as lawbreakers, as transgressors, but they were not transgressors of the laws of Yahweh. They may have come across certain laws of the kings or the Pharisees who were tied in with the kings, but they were not guilty of breaking Yahweh's laws, which bring a man to perfection and solve all problems. He kept his intention on the work. So who has believed our report? Why did he put that here? Because some people didn't. But what the elders of Israel did, like they did in the days of Samuel. They rose up together in force and they organized themselves so they had a power. They were a power to deal with. And they rose up before Samuel and they wanted to go and worship the God. So what they did here is they came to accept and tolerate God worship. Then the chief priests and the scribes and the elders of the people assembled at the palace of the high priest. So you see he had a high place here. And they interviewed the locals. What do you think about these people here who were more than relieved to express their opinions about what they thought about the house of Yahweh? And at this time, they're allowed, our persecutors and the news media, and so they're allowed to remain in that ignorance as a test to us. Will we retaliate? No, we won't. Just as Yeshua did not. Does Yahweh value the sinners less? No, that's what his plan is for the sinners, to bring all to repentance eventually in their time. They were still following the system and still had this organization that kept it under control. But at this time, they were trying to wipe out the teaching of Yahweh, the teaching of the Savior who was to come and to be sacrificed for the last or seventh era. So you see what occurred here. They tried to stomp out the house of Yahweh, but they couldn't. That was the plan from there clear down to now. That was the finishing plan. And they were trying to knock it out back then. They were trying to kill Yeshua, thinking that would stop it. They killed Abel, thinking it would stop there. They killed many of the prophets, thinking it would stop. But it was already done. Yahweh had already accomplished through Yeshua what was necessary through the law, even tricking Satan. So she was behind the plan here. She didn't catch up. And they could not stop the plan. And part of that plan was a setup for us now in these last days. May Yahweh bless your understanding. If you'll please stand now. It's my honor to turn over the class to our next great teacher, the great Khan Zephaniah. Praise Yahweh. Carry it on.
Shalom, everyone. Shabbat Shalom. You may be seated. Well, we're going to continue where Great Kahan left off, and we're going to pick up on page 65. And just a couple points that were made here. You know, we are the fulfillment of this plan, and as we're going to look at one of the scriptures here in Hebrews chapter 12, and Pastor explains why he thinks that Yeshua wrote the book of Hebrews, or had somebody, write it as he told him to write it. But we're going to cover that. But we're also going to look at chapter 12 in Hebrews, verses 1 and 2, and Pastor's going to explain that. And there's a section in there for the joy that is set before him, that Yeshua did certain things. And this is something that we need to keep in our minds as well, that there is great joy that is set before us. And we're going to see this as we go over this sermon from Yeshua's memorial in 2015, that Yeshua, even in his great suffering, or, he was about to go through this great ordeal, this, to the point of his death, he still was teaching, as we're going to see an example, as he corrected the disciples that were distressing a woman. And, he looked forward to being seated at Yahweh's right hand, and that was the joy that was set before him. And we have a great joy that's set before us as well. But we have to make it through this time period. We have to pass our tests, and we have to rejoice in doing so as well. Let's look at verse 47, and Combat Seal touch on this a little bit here. Then the chief priests and the scribes and the elders of the people assembled at the palace. Well, the palace, notice, these are the high up-to-dos. And pastor says they're not the ones that have holes in their shoes. They're not the ones who pick corn in the field or walk through the cornfields. They wouldn't be seen in a cornfield. They wouldn't be seen milking a cow or making cheese or making butter or cooking bread. That was too low of a thing for them. Okay? And I want to show you the comparison of these two attitudes. The attitudes of the scribes and the Pharisees and the attitude that Yeshua had. Well, if you look down here in verse 47, this was the attitude, this was the careless of these people. But Yeshua did not have this attitude. Yeshua worked to take care of his people, even to feed them. And this is as we go and as we celebrate or observe Yeshua's memorial over the years, hopefully we understand the very basic of Yeshua paid the price, for our sins, and he gave us an opportunity because otherwise our life would be owed. But hopefully we understand a lot deeper that Yeshua is our example. And when we partake of that bread and wine, we're saying we want to be like that man and do what he did. And that was serving. He took care of others, and his mind was on others. Let's look at verse 49. But they said, you'd think, and Pastor says here, you'd think civilization would have changed by now, wouldn't you? You'd think it would be different. But it's almost like he's describing our generation right now. The same attitudes from where the hatred comes. And this hatred is the same. In fact, it even says that it'll grow colder. The love will grow colder in our time period. But the hatred was severe against Yeshua, and it's severe against the House of Yahweh in these last days. Won't always be that way, but it is right now. And have you seen the wars that are raging right now while I'm speaking right now, and the people suffering? Thousands and thousands getting killed all over the world now, kept back from Texas so far, but all over the world. Okay, and let's look down to verse 53 here. And Pastor's reading in Matthew chapter 26. If you have your scriptures, Matthew 26, or if you're following along in the book of Israel, it's verse 53. We'll look down to verse 10 of Matthew chapter 26. But Yeshua, aware of this, said to them, why do you distress the woman? And this was what Nora had done for Yeshua. And remember, she had anointed him, and that was part of the law, that this be done. So what she did was actually in fulfillment of a law. And these are the things that I always look forward to Yeshua's memorial sermons, because it seems that Pastor, he always brings something out that just kind of leaves me saying, wow, that's pretty intense. And the understanding there, and he says things that in these sermons, Yeshua's memorial sermons, that just really, stand out. But they were distressing this woman. Now, can you get that in your mind? Can you even fathom the situation here where Yeshua is about to die? He's about to be arrested. He's about to be killed, tortured all night long, and he knows it. He knows he's going to be tortured, and his body is going to be beaten to shreds, bruises with thorns stuck down in his head on top of a crown. He knew all of this, and he was scolding his disciples for distressing a woman. You see the caring there in that man? And that is pretty amazing. Think about, and maybe this doesn't occur to any of you, just to me, but, if I got something on my mind and I'm thinking about it, I can totally block out everything going around me. Somebody could be calling my name or saying something, and I'm focused on this, and I'm not even hearing, whatever is going around. But Yeshua, having all this on his mind that he was about to go through, was still realizing here the situation taking place, and he was correcting the disciples, saying, why are you doing this? It's not right. In fact, he even said what she did here was a righteous work, and it was actually a lawful work. Okay? So we had that great caring there that Yeshua possessed. That's our high priest. Okay, so let's turn the page here and moving along in Matthew chapter 26 here. Yeshua says, wherever this message will be preached in the whole world, what this woman has done will also be told as a memorial for her. Now, verse 58. Then one of the 12, called Yad Iscariot, went to the chief priests, and then he got money for it, 30 pieces of silver. Then he took that, and he took that money later on, brought it back to them, and bought Yeshua back. But they lost their deal. And that's something else that Pastor explained in Yeshua's memorial sermon, and actually a couple sermons prior to 1 year. But he explained that, and if you want to learn more about it, all you got to do is go to Yisrael Says program, and punch in 30 pieces of silver. And you'll see some of the references come up. But it was pretty interesting, and I want to read you a quote from the 5th book of Yisrael, chapter 19, verse 87. Therefore, he was sinless. Of course, this was Yeshua, right? And Yahweh could give Yeshua's life to pay for ours. There could be no payment if he had not done this. So what about Yeshua? All right, what about Yeshua's life? Before his death, it was so neat what took place. Out of greed, the House of Yahweh, which was established in Jerusalem, actually paid for Yeshua's life and bought it back from Satan before he ever died. So as Kambetzil mentioned that, Yahweh was always one step, and he always is one step ahead of Satan. Satan tried to, she tried to throw a little wrench in the plan, so to speak. But Yahweh being ahead of that, he already had thought of that, and the House of Yahweh actually bought Yeshua back. Praise Yahweh. The House of Yahweh offered 30 pieces of silver for Yeshua. He went ahead and gave his life, so when Yahweh brought him back to life, Yeshua belonged to Yahweh again, never to be given to Satan. And like I said, you can go there and read about that. Just go to the Yisrayl Says program. It's really great. If you've never used it, you really need to try it. It's an excellent program. You can type in anything, and it will bring up all the references. Okay, so let's continue on here. So that's how Yeshua was actually bought back. Never belonged to Satan. And let's look down to verse 59 now. But in Hebrews, I want you to turn over to Hebrews, a book that I say was written by Yeshua. I think he had, the way it was written, I think he had a writer, because it's speaking first person sometimes, and then second person sometimes. But you find that in the other writings too, where Isaiah and Yeketskiah speak, so there's no surprise. And I want to give you an example of that, because we had a song at the feast here, the Song of the 10 Kings. Who wrote the Song of the 10 Kings? That's right, Yisrael Hawkins. Okay, Pastor wrote it. And in one of the verses here, in verse 4, it says, Yahweh's great witness and Yeshua's donkeys are now singing to you this song. So can you tell who wrote that? You can't tell, can you? Anybody could have said, Yahweh's great witness and Yeshua's donkeys are now singing to you this song. But Pastor wrote it. So when we see in Hebrews chapter 12, and it says, looking to Yeshua, Yeshua could have wrote that himself, looking to Yeshua. Do you see? You see the example there? But that's what Pastor is referring to when he says sometimes it seems like it's in first person or maybe second person. And and that's an example. And others, Isaiah and Yeketskiah, some of the other writings, they do the same thing. So don't be thrown off by where it says looking to Yeshua. Well, he would have said looking to me if he would have written it. No, not necessarily. Looking to Yeshua. He's writing as if he's saying look to me, but he's using his name there, looking to Yeshua. Okay, so let's continue here. It says, but the knowledge, and this is in verse 60, and this was really interesting here. But the knowledge in this book is way past anything I've seen in the entire scriptures of any of the prophets. It amazes me every time I study this book, speaking of the book of Hebrews, to see what a magnificent writing and writer he was and how he brought this forth so simply, but he hid it. He hid so many things here from the world, it's so amazing. And of course, it's hidden to the world, but it's revealed to the house of Yahweh because Yeshua himself qualified, remember, he qualified to open those seals and give it to the last day's witness, the seventh Malach, who would give it to us. You know, we see that in the book of Revelation, and in Revelation chapter 4, I believe it's verse 5 or verse 6 there, it refers to the 7 lamps burning that we see every Sabbath here, and there's 2 words that we should think of when we see that menorah. What is it? What are those 2 words that menorah should remind us? Every time we see that menorah here, we should remember something very special that was only given to us, the house of Yahweh, in these last days. The complete plan. The complete plan. We're the only ones. Remember the examples, Daniel, for instance, who longed to understand. Remember, he wanted to understand so much it made the man sick because he wanted to understand what these things meant. Okay, but he couldn't. He had to wait. You know, and we'll give that knowledge to Daniel. But we have this understanding, and that's that's a very special blessing to be in the last days house of Yahweh. We should always look at it that way, that our opportunity right now, it can't be compared to anything. You know, we should realize the joy that's set before us, like Yeshua saw the joy set before him. Okay, so continuing. Well, anyways, Hebrews chapter 12 here, and this is verse 62. Now look at this closely, because in these 2 verses right here, you could preach 100 sermons if you would just study this and see what this man is showing you. I've never seen anything like it. And the more I study it, the more I see how brilliant it is. It's almost like having the mind of Yahweh himself when you read this. Hebrews 12, verse 1. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses. Well, what's he talking about? Witnesses. I call heaven and earth as witnesses against you. And hopefully, with the sermons that Pastor gave us here at the Great Feast of Tabernacles and last great day, we understand more about witnesses and the trial that each and every one of us are on right now. As Job was on trial, he was the one on trial that day. Remember, you know, when the accuser, when Satan came to Yahweh, Job was on trial. We're on trial. We're on trial right now. And heaven and earth are witnesses. It's open. This is being shown. This is being openly shown. And remember, all creation is waiting for the revealing of the sons of Yahweh, the sons and daughters of Yahweh, those that like Job, will pass his tests and will prove to be worthy. Well, these are these witnesses that are looking at you now from heaven and earth. Okay, let's look over at verse 67. Let us lay aside every weight, and this is a continuation here. He's going through chapter 12, verses 1 and 2 in Hebrews. Let us lay aside every weight. Well, that means encumbrance. I don't know how deep the people are getting now with the scriptures, but I always urge people to use some references to know what the word means. But weight here means encumbrance. And this is not weight like you weight something out, but this is weight as in like something heavy, like you would weigh something. It's something heavy. It means to hold back or to hinder. Well, who's holding the world back and keeping it tied up in war, sickness, disease, and hatred? It's coming from the 7 hills of Rome, of course. They're witnessing to this big time, and the Pope is making certain comments about the man who knows it all down here in Texas. Every encumbrance or every hindrance, every burden, to put aside these things, put these things aside, the sin which so easily entraps us. Okay, and this is something there we have to, as a great Kahan mentioned right away in the beginning, let's come to Yeshua's memorial and the feast of Passover, unleavened bread here this coming year as we go from feast to feast. Let's come there not looking back and having regret or so forth, but let's come there rejoicing and being satisfied that we overcame and we pushed forward and used this work and we rejoiced. We followed the instruction that we were given in the house of Yahweh. We did what the witness has instructed us to do. Let's come there with that attitude. Well, now, this book is not doing away with the laws. Okay, and Pastor mentions here that, because he's saying the sin which so easily entraps us, they're referring to sins. Not as if they're done away with. Of course, he's still teaching you got to put sin away. Sin is the breaking of Yahweh's law. Okay, let's look down here. You see how skillfully he says it? Put away these encumbrances and the sin which so easily entraps you. Sin. Well, he tells you later what sin is in the same book and tells you what they did away with and so forth in the same book and spells it out so perfectly for you, which so easily entraps you, and let us run the race. Run the race that is set before us with endurance. With endurance. And, that word has to be for our generation. We have to have endurance. Endurance. In fact, we're going to see here that we're told here we can't grow weary. We can't grow weary of passing our tests, of the suffering and so forth. Yes, we are given in this time period to suffer and to be tested and tried. But as Yeshua was, we need to follow his example and look forward to the joy that is set before us. And that is going to be a tremendous blessing. And we're going to see here that we'll look back at these things and we'll tell our grandchildren later and we'll have a laugh about them. And, but that's when we pass them and we get to that point. But we have to go through this right now. This is for our perfection. This is what Yahweh is doing for us to get us to that point that we could be in that image and likeness, and we can have that character like Yeshua did. And let's look down here now, looking to Yeshua. Okay, looking to Yeshua. And this is verse 2 of Hebrews chapter 12. Who for the joy. You see that? This man was joyous. The night of his murder. He was joyous to say to the world, this woman is going to be talked about throughout all eternity. She anointed my body for this burial. He was joyous to be teaching his disciples what was going to be taking place with him that night, in fact. Okay, so looking to Yeshua, who was led and perfected by the faith, who for the joy that was set before him, where? Where was that joy set before Yeshua? Where was it set before Yeshua? In the prophecy, that's right. And Yeshua knew that. And that's the same place it's set before us. As we see that, search out the book of Yahweh and read, not one of these will fail. Just like we know the seventh era of the house of Yahweh, we will inherit the kingdom. We will take these positions. It's there before us. So that's the same joy before us that's set there in prophecy. So it was set before him in prophecy, brethren. This is what he's talking about here. It was set before him in prophecy. And he gives you hints throughout the book of Hebrews. Okay? Verse 74. You see that joy. This joy. Counted it as joy that was set before him. A man who was going to be arrested and tortured, a slow death coming the next day, and knowing it, and yet with joy endured the sacrifice, despising the shame. Couldn't anyone know this but him himself? Okay. So we see in verse 75, Pastor makes mention that in many years we've suffered, but we kept growing and growing until Yahweh brought us up to this state right now. And then the last part of the house of Yahweh is going to be the greatest thing that has ever taken place in man's history, hands down. Nothing to be compared to what we're going through right now and what we're going to see. And in fact, that's what the prophets say. It will always be said, Yahweh lives, who brought us through Yeshua the high priest and the house of Yahweh, led this great group out of this Babylonian teaching of rebellion. You know, the ones that came out of the nuclear age. That will be forever spoken of, this work that we're a part of right now. That's part of the joy that's set before us. It can't be compared to anything. So, verse 76, so that you would not become weary and faint in your minds. Well, keep that in mind as you suffer the tests, looking to Yeshua the first, and consider it, and don't faint in your minds. Now, that word weary from Merriam-Webster's Dictionary.com, weary means exhausted in strength or endurance. And this is what we're told. Don't let this set in. Don't become exhausted in your endurance. Having one's patience or tolerance exhausted. And it's used with soon grew weary of waiting. It just didn't want to wait any longer. And, you know, we've heard the sermons, one of which was given on the Day of Atonement. Yes, we're going to have to wait. We're going to have to wait. And that's what the prophets told us. You know, wait on Yahweh. Though it seems long, or so it seems slow, wait for it. It's not going to fail. It is coming to pass, but we are going to have to keep enduring, and we're going to have to wait on Yahweh. You know, Yahweh is going to do His part. There's no doubt there. Yahweh is going to do His part. We need to do ours. And Yahweh's He gives us the strength here. He's going to help us through. Okay, let's cover a few more points here. Okay, so the Apostle Shaul here, and verse 81, Pastor, he shows us here that the Apostle Shaul, he spoke about Yeshua's memorial in 1 Corinthians 11, verse 23, and what he says here, for I received from Yeshua that which I also delivered to you, that Yeshua Messiah on the same night in which He was betrayed took bread. And when He had given thanks, He broke it and said, take, eat. This represents my body, which is broken for you, and do this in remembrance of me. Well, you know from this right here that this was practiced. And the apostle here sang this. These were many years later, and he was saying this and writing this book of Corinthians for us. You see here that this was being practiced year by year, but it was being practiced wrong, and he was correcting the people that he was writing to, saying, here's the way you should do this. It's not just going to a person's house and eating a meal. So he's scolding the people here for having done it wrong, and he's hoping to come and do it with them, as he showed in the same book. But of course, that didn't work. He wasn't able to get back to them. Okay, so there's somebody that they learned from Yeshua's example, and they taught others. And this is what we have to do. We have to teach others as well. Okay, and then in verses 82 through 84, the covenant, because that's talked about also in Hebrews chapter 12. And this is the covenant that Yahweh says, I'll put my laws in your hearts, and in your inward parts I'll write them. Okay, that's a covenant, and that covenant it's a never-ending covenant. Just because the children of Israel turned away and broke the covenant, it's not a sign that the covenant disappeared. Okay, the covenant still stands, as he said in Hebrews 10 verse 16. All right, so that covenant still stands. And Pastor, in verse 85 here, he says, as you work and learn and teach and educate yourselves in the work of Yahweh, you become more like Yeshua every day. Even this sermon right now, this night, right here, have brought you an inch or two closer to the end of this race that is set before us to finish. And that's I remember Pastor making a comment, how important every Sabbath day is. And if we miss a Sabbath, we miss a certain portion of spirit holy there. We miss a certain growth. And that, he kind of hints at it right there. It's an inch or two that will bring us closer to being like Yeshua. You know, we have to be here at our appointments with Yahweh so that we don't miss out. We have to be here. It's important. Or, you know, we're tuning in. Well, let's talk about these in a few closing minutes here. Let's talk a little bit about these tests and trials. Let's turn to page 70 as we're getting close to here and wrapping it up. Verse 88. Well, we'll cover that later on in this feast, verses 2 through 4. And again there, I see it in verse 16 and then verse 19, where he says, "For I believe there have to be factions among you." And these are these little divisions or separations, or, you know, Pastor refers to them as frictions, the rubbing, rubbing each other the wrong way. Well, I see these things and I see what's taking place. I see there are still factions or frictions among you. In order, going back to the scripture here, that those who are approved may be plainly evident among you. Well, that's where the frictions were set in. Some people were weak, some were stronger, but they were having friction. You all don't have that, I know. You've all grown to unity now, and you never have frictions between you, right? You know, Pastor laughing here. Well, it will come. It will come. And one thing about it, after this, you can start looking forward to Yeshua helping you to enjoy the frictions that come and laugh about them later, like we're laughing about it. We're laughing about them now, right? Didn't amount to a thing, did it? Didn't amount to a hill of beans, and we overcome them. And these frictions today, they'll be forgotten tomorrow. All right? Keep that in mind. The frictions today, they'll be forgotten tomorrow. And you can tell your grandchildren later, and you can have a big laugh about how stupid you were when you did that, right? Yeah. All right? So keep that in mind. You know, what we're going through right now, it is for our time period. We have to go through it. We should want to go through it. We should want to be like Yeshua, you know, but we need to look forward to that joy that is set before us. We see it in prophecy. It's there for us. Look at verse 94. "But let a man examine himself and see. Do you have caring? Do you have caring for your brothers and sisters? Are you lacking in it? Well, look at Yeshua." That's what he's telling you here. Look at Yeshua. He's the finisher of the faith right there. He's the one who shows you the example that he himself followed. You know, he did it. He did it first. Remember, that's what he said, the first one. So he gave us the example. Okay, and if he wouldn't have done it, he wouldn't have qualified to tell us, look at what I did. That's the same thinking that we need to apply when we go through our tests and trials. After we've gone through it, we'll be able to say to those, no, you'll be able to make it. You know, you can make it. We made it. I made it. Because we went through it. And now he serves with Yahweh as high priest. And that was the joy that was set before Yeshua. You know, be seated at Yahweh's right hand. What a blessing. Okay, and in the last verse here, "Brethren, go your way this evening and keep Yeshua on your mind. Think of the works he did and his example of perfect servitude. May Yahweh bless you, and I'll turn the services over to the next leader."